It started like any other evening, except I could already feel the heaviness in the air the moment I walked into the room. My mom was there, her expression sharp, her voice ready to bite at the slightest excuse. That was her power, her way of keeping everyone on edge. I had grown up under that shadow, where nothing I said or did ever seem to measure up, where silence was safer than speaking, where even the smallest misstep could ignite her anger. But I didn't expect that night would be the one that carved itself into my memory forever. I stood there, holding back words I wanted to say, and that's when she turned to me, her eyes cold, her tone dripping with disdain, and she said it, "Don't pretend you matter." Those 4 words hit me harder than anything I'd ever heard, harder than punishments, harder than insults that I had learned to shrug off over the years. It wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration, a statement that in her eyes I was nothing, that I was invisible, disposable, irrelevant. The room felt like it had shrunk, like the walls themselves were pressing in on me. For a moment, my body froze, my hands shaking slightly, though I tried to hide it. I had heard things like this before, but this one sentence seemed to strip me of the last bit of dignity I had been clinging to. I could hear the echo of those words in my head, bouncing around louder and louder, repeating over and over again until it felt like my chest might crack from the weight of it. The others in the room said nothing. They just glanced away, as if ignoring it made it disappear, as if pretending not to hear it was easier than standing up for me. That silence cut almost as deep as her words, because it confirmed what she had just said, that to them, I didn't matter. I had always wondered what it would feel like to reach my breaking point, to finally stop swallowing the pain, to stop pretending I was okay. That night, I found out. Every memory of her dismissing me, every moment she compared me to someone else, every cruel laugh at my expense came flooding back all at once. I thought of the times I stayed awake at night, wondering why I wasn't enough for her, why nothing I did could ever win her approval. I thought of how many times I forced a smile just to avoid more conflict, how many times I buried my voice so deep inside that it started to feel like I didn't even have one. All of that collided with her words in that instant, and I felt something inside me snap. But the strange thing was, with that breaking point came a sudden clarity. Instead of collapsing, I started to feel a fire rising within me. The more I replayed her words, the more I realized that maybe the truth wasn't that I didn't matter, it was that she wanted me to believe it. She wanted me small, quiet, obedient, invisible, because it kept her in control. That realization stung, but it also fueled me. My mom, the person who should have been my protector, my encourager, my safe place, had chosen to belittle me instead. And for the first time, I wasn't willing to just stand there and accept it. Her face, so certain, so smug, as she dismissed me, made me want to scream. I wanted to shake the entire house, to force everyone to look at me and see that I wasn't some shadow they could keep in the background. I wanted to prove that I mattered more than they would ever admit. It was a strange mix of pain and determination swirling inside me, but it was powerful. My silence was no longer protection, it was a cage, and her words had just shattered the lock. I looked around the room, and though I didn't say anything yet, I could feel my entire presence shift. She might have thought she had broken me, but what she didn't know was that she had just awakened a part of me she couldn't control anymore. The part of me that remembered every injustice, every dismissal, every cruel remark, and was ready to finally let them know that I wasn't their pawn, their scapegoat, their forgotten piece. I mattered. More than she would ever admit. More than they were ready to handle. That night, when she said those words, she thought she was winning. She thought she had crushed me for good, silenced me forever. What she didn't realize was that she had planted the seed of her own undoing. Because from that moment on, I stopped being afraid of her opinion, of her judgment, of her control. From that moment, I knew something was going to change, and it would change in a way that none of them could take back. The years of silence were heavier than chains, dragging me down every single day in ways no one else could see. On the surface, I played the role they expected of me, the quiet one, the one who didn't argue back, the one who swallowed their pride for the sake of peace. But inside, there was a storm brewing, one that grew stronger with every insult, every mocking glance, every reminder that in that house, I was never seen as equal. Humiliation became routine, like background noise to my life. My opinions didn't matter, my feelings didn't count, my dreams were laughed at or dismissed before they ever had a chance to breathe. I was made to feel like nothing, like I was just there to take up space, but never to belong. It wasn't just the words they said, though those cut deeply. It was the tone, the looks, the constant comparison to everyone else. My siblings' smallest successes were celebrated, magnified, paraded in front of me, while my own efforts disappeared into the void. If I brought home good grades, it was brushed aside with a shrug, as if I was just doing what was expected. If I failed at anything, it was treated as proof that I wasn't capable, that I wasn't worth investing in. I learned quickly that speaking up only invited ridicule. My silence became my shield, but it also became my prison. Every time I wanted to say something and didn't, a little piece of me disappeared. I remember dinners where I would sit at the table, hearing laughter and conversation all around me, but none of it ever directed at me. I was present, but I wasn't part of them. My voice felt invisible, swallowed by the sound of everyone else's importance. Sometimes I wondered if they even noticed when I was quiet, or if they preferred it that way. I'd sit there, chewing my food slowly, watching as my siblings told stories and my parents leaned in to listen, knowing that if I tried to add something, it would either be ignored or brushed off with a sarcastic comment. After enough times, I stopped trying. I became an observer in my own family, watching life happen around me, but never with me. Humiliation wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was in the little things, the way my mom's eyes would roll when I entered the room, the way she sighed as if my presence was a burden, the way she reminded me of every mistake I had ever made as though she kept them cataloged just to throw them back at me. Those small cuts added up until I felt like I was bleeding on the inside all the time. I started questioning myself constantly. Maybe I really didn't matter. Maybe I was just fooling myself into thinking I deserved more. That's how deep their words dug into me. They made me doubt my very existence, doubt the idea that I could ever be enough for anyone. The worst part was pretending. Pretending it didn't hurt, pretending I was used to it, pretending I was strong enough to handle it. But late at night, when the house was quiet and no one could hear me, the mask would fall away. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every reminder that I was invisible. Some nights I would cry quietly, pressing my face into my pillow so no one would hear. Other nights I would just feel numb, empty, wondering what the point of even trying was. The silence I carried during the day turned into a scream in my head at night, but no one else ever knew. Year after year, I told myself things would get better, that one day they would finally see me for who I was, that they would finally recognize I had value. But deep down, I stopped believing it. Hope faded into habit, and habit became survival. I learned how to shrink myself so I wouldn't take up too much space, how to make myself invisible to avoid being targeted, how to live in the shadows of everyone else. And the more I stayed silent, the more they reinforced the idea that I didn't deserve to be heard. They mistook my quiet for weakness, not realizing that every word I held back was storing fuel for a fire they weren't prepared for. Looking back, I can see how much those years shaped me. They wanted me small, and for a long time I gave them exactly that. But inside, every insult was recorded, every humiliation stored away. I carried them with me like weights, but I also knew that one day, those weights could turn into weapons. They thought they were silencing me forever, but all they were really doing was building the foundation for the moment I would finally open my mouth and release everything I had been holding in. They thought I had accepted my role as the quiet one, the forgotten one, the unimportant one. What they didn't realize was that I was only waiting for the right moment. There comes a moment when the weight of silence becomes unbearable, when the fear of speaking is no longer greater than the pain of holding everything in. For me, that moment arrived suddenly, like a switch flipping inside me. I had spent years shrinking, years convincing myself that staying quiet was safer, that it was better to let them win the arguments than to invite more humiliation. But then I remembered that night, my mom's words cutting through me like a blade, "Don't pretend you matter." They rang in my head over and over, each repetition igniting something I didn't know I had left. I realized that silence wasn't protection anymore. It was surrender, and I had been surrendering my entire life without even realizing it. That was when I made the decision that I would finally speak, and I didn't care what storm it brought, the courage didn't come all at once. It started as a flicker, a thought I tried to ignore. What if I finally said what I had been holding back for so long? What if I stopped pretending their words didn't affect me? What if I forced them to face the truth they had been trying to bury under years of control and cruelty? The more I asked myself those questions, the louder the answers became. I had spent too long being their shadow, too long watching them treat me like I didn't exist, too long sacrificing my voice just to keep the peace. There was no peace in silence anymore, only suffocation, and I was done choking on it. I remember the exact moment it happened. My mom was in the middle of one of her usual tirades, her words sharp, calculated to humiliate me in front of everyone else. My siblings sat there, pretending to be busy with their phones, their plates, anything that would keep them from making eye contact. I felt the familiar sting in my chest, the urge to look down and pretend I hadn't heard. But instead of shrinking, I lifted my head. I looked straight at her, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what would come next. The words had already been forming inside me, waiting for this moment, and I knew that once I let them out, there would be no going back. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me, because I had always imagined that if I ever dared to speak, it would come out weak, uncertain, easily drowned out. But it didn't. It was steady, clear, louder than I thought possible. It carried years of silence, years of pain, years of humiliation behind it, and it demanded to be heard. The words poured out of me, sharp and deliberate, tearing through the air like they had been waiting all this time for release. I didn't plan them. I didn't rehearse them. They came from somewhere deeper, a place that had been silenced for far too long. And once they started, I couldn't stop. Everyone froze. The room that had always been filled with her dominance, her control, her voice towering over mine, suddenly shifted. For the first time, she wasn't the one commanding the air. I was. Her face tightened, her eyes narrowed, but I could see the flicker of something else behind them, shock. She hadn't expected me to fight back. She had spent so many years convincing herself that I was too weak, too small, too broken to ever stand up to her. But in that moment, all her certainty began to crack. She tried to cut me off, to shut me down the way she always did, but my voice pushed through louder, stronger, unstoppable. It was liberating in a way I had never imagined. Every word I spoke was like breaking another chain, shattering another wall they had built around me. I called out the years of cruelty, the constant comparisons, the way they had treated me like I was invisible. I told them the truth they had never wanted to hear, that I wasn't their pawn, I wasn't their scapegoat, and I wasn't going to live my life in silence anymore. The more I spoke, the more I could see their faces changing. My siblings' eyes widened, unsure if they should look away or keep watching. My father shifted uncomfortably, like he didn't know how to respond. And my mom, for once, had no words. That silence from her was louder than anything she had ever said. Inside me, something broke free. It wasn't just anger, though anger was there, burning hot and raw. It was also relief, a sense that I was finally standing in my own truth, no matter the consequences. I didn't care if they hated me for it. I didn't care if it caused more fights, more distance, more chaos. All I cared about was that I was no longer burying myself alive to make them comfortable. For the first time, I was living, breathing, speaking as if I mattered, and I could feel the power of that truth filling every part of me. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The moment I decided to speak, I knew everything would change. There was no going back to silence, no pretending that I could be invisible again. They had pushed me too far, broken me too many times, and now they would see the person they had tried so hard to erase. My words weren't just words, they were a declaration, a promise, a shift in the very foundation of the life we had been living. And even as I stood there, watching the shock ripple across their faces, I knew deep down that this was only the beginning of what was to come. The words that left my mouth that night were not planned, not rehearsed, not softened to make anyone comfortable. They came out raw, unfiltered, carrying the weight of years of silence that had been forced on me. Each sentence was a blade cutting through the lies they had built, exposing the truths they never wanted to face. I told my mother how her words had shaped me, how every time she dismissed me or belittled me it dug into my skin like poison. I reminded her of the countless times she celebrated others while pretending I wasn't even in the room, how she chose to compare me instead of seeing me, how she deliberately made me feel like less so she could feel like more. The words tumbled out one after another, sharper than I thought possible, and for the first time, I wasn't holding back. I saw the shock in their faces as I spoke. My siblings looked between me and her as though they were watching something they thought could never happen. My father shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing not at me, but at the realization that the truth I was spilling was undeniable. My mom's lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes burning with the kind of rage that had always kept me silent, but this time I didn't stop. Her glare no longer had power over me. My voice was steady, cutting through every attempt she made to shut me down. She tried to interrupt, to dismiss me the way she always had, but I spoke louder. Refusing to be drowned out, I told them how it felt to sit at the dinner table invisible, how it felt to hear laughter and celebration but never be part of it, how it felt to constantly be told I wasn't enough. I let them know about the nights I stayed awake wondering if maybe she was right, if maybe I really didn't matter, if maybe my life had no meaning beyond being the family's punching bag. I described the ache of knowing that no matter what I achieved, it would never measure up, and the sting of realizing that sometimes she wanted me to fail just so she could prove her point. My words weren't just accusations, they were confessions of the pain I had carried, proof of the scars they had left behind. The more I spoke, the heavier the air became. No one moved. No one dared to laugh it off or make light of it. My words held them hostage, and for once, I was the one in control. I could feel the power shifting with every truth I exposed. My siblings' expressions flickered between guilt and fear because they too had played their part in my silence, standing by while I was pushed down again and again. My father's silence spoke volumes because he had known, he had seen, and he had chosen to do nothing. And my mother, the woman who had always prided herself on being the strongest voice in the room, suddenly had no defense against mine. It wasn't just about the past, it was about the present too. I told them that I had finally realized the truth, that the reason she wanted me to believe I didn't matter was because she knew deep down that I did. She knew I carried something inside me that terrified her: independence, strength, resilience. She tried to crush it before it could grow, but instead she only made it stronger. My silence had been my prison, but now my voice was my weapon, and I was using it without mercy. I laid bare every manipulation, every insult, every calculated attempt to keep me small. I exposed the cracks in the family they worked so hard to present as perfect. I tore apart the illusion that she was a loving mother, revealing the bitterness and cruelty she tried to hide behind a mask of control. Her face flushed, her breathing quickened, and for a moment I thought she might lash out, scream, throw something, anything to regain control. But she didn't. She stayed frozen, stunned, unable to stop the flood of words crashing over her. The silence in the room wasn't like the silence I had known before. This was different. This silence was theirs, not mine. It was the silence of people who had no defense, who had been caught in their own lies, who had been forced to confront the truth they could no longer deny. And I stood in the middle of it, unafraid, stronger than I had ever been. It wasn't easy to say those things. Every word scraped against the years of conditioning that told me to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to protect them even when they destroyed me. But with each sentence, the weight on my chest lifted. I was no longer suffocating under the pressure of secrets and unspoken pain. I was breathing for the first time in years, and it felt intoxicating. I could feel my voice shaking the foundation of everything they had built, and I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. This was my chance to reclaim myself, to remind them and myself that I mattered more than they ever wanted to admit. When I finally paused, the silence was deafening. The room that had always been hers was mine now. My words lingered in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to erase. Their eyes told me everything I needed to know. They were stunned, shaken, uncertain of what would come next. And for once, I didn't care. I had spoken the truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of my words was immediate, like a storm breaking loose after years of building pressure. The room, once so controlled by her voice and her rules, was now filled with a thick silence that none of them knew how to break. My mother's face was tight with rage, her hands clenching and unclenching as though she couldn't decide whether to scream or strike. My father shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between us, searching for a way to restore order, but finding none. My siblings stared wide-eyed, the shock written all over their faces as though they were witnessing something they had never imagined possible. The control they had always believed she had was slipping right through her fingers, and they could all feel it. The weight of my words hung in the air, suffocating, undeniable, impossible to sweep away for so long. I had imagined that if I ever spoke out, they would laugh at me, dismiss me, tell me I was exaggerating or being dramatic. But that night, they didn't laugh. They couldn't. The truth was too sharp, too precise, too rooted in memories they couldn't deny. Every word I had spoken was a reflection of reality they had chosen to ignore, and now it was staring them in the face. My mom opened her mouth once, maybe to retort, maybe to regain control, but no sound came. For the first time in my life, she didn't have a comeback ready, and the sight of her speechless face was more powerful than anything else I had ever experienced. The shock rippled outward, and it wasn't just hers. My siblings, who had spent years pretending not to see what was happening, suddenly had to confront the fact that they had been complicit in my silence. They avoided my eyes, fidgeting nervously, as though the guilt of their indifference was pressing down on them. My father, usually so detached and unwilling to intervene, seemed visibly unsettled. He had always thought that staying quiet was safer, that turning away was easier, but now he was forced to face the reality that his silence had been just as destructive as her cruelty. The chaos wasn't loud, not at first, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface, a fragile balance cracking apart. The atmosphere in the house changed after that night. Every interaction felt different, charged with tension they couldn't hide. My mom tried to regain control in small ways, snide comments, exaggerated sighs, attempts to humiliate me in front of others, but they no longer had the same effect. Her words no longer pierced me the way they used to. They fell flat, powerless, because she had already revealed herself. Everyone had already seen the cracks, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't patch them up again. The power she held over me had been shattered, and though she wanted desperately to put me back in my place, she couldn't erase what had been said. The truth had been spoken, and once it was out there, it refused to be buried again. The chaos spread beyond just her and me. My siblings began treating me differently, though they didn't know how to handle it. Some days they seemed wary of me, like I was a stranger they didn't quite know anymore. Other days, there was a flicker of respect in their eyes, the kind of acknowledgement I had never seen from them before. My father, too, seemed uncertain. He avoided confrontation more than ever, but there was a heaviness in the way he looked at me, as though he was finally realizing the cost of his silence all those years. They were all forced to live with the truth now, and it unsettled them more than I could have imagined, but the most noticeable change was in her. My mother, the woman who had always spoken with authority, who had always been so sure of herself, now seemed restless, uneasy, like she was constantly aware of the shift in the house. She was no longer untouchable. My words had stripped away her armor, and no matter how much she tried to rebuild it, the cracks showed. She became more defensive, more volatile, snapping over small things, lashing out not just at me but at anyone who crossed her. It was as if she knew that her grip on control was slipping, and she was fighting desperately to hold on to whatever scraps remained. But the harder she fought, the clearer it became that she had already lost. The chaos wasn't just inside the walls of our home. It began to bleed into the way others saw us too. Relatives who once praised her began to notice the tension. Friends who admired her control began to see the strain. The perfect image she had worked so hard to project was crumbling, and though she tried to pretend everything was fine, the truth leaked out in every interaction, every strained smile, every awkward silence when I walked into the room. My words had not just shaken our family, they had shaken the illusion she had spent her life creating. And that illusion was something she could never fully rebuild for me. The shock and chaos were liberating. It wasn't easy to live in the aftermath, with the tension and the glares and the whispered conversations when they thought I couldn't hear. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. The chaos was proof that things had changed, that my voice had power, that the truth couldn't be silenced anymore. They might have been unsettled, they might have been angry, they might have been in denial, but they could never return to the way things were before. My words had carved a permanent line in the sand, and nothing could erase it. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice the lasting impact. Conversations shifted around me. They weighed their words more carefully, as though they were afraid I might call them out again. My mom's dominance wavered, and while she tried to rebuild it, she knew deep down that it was gone forever. My siblings, once content to stand by, began to realize that silence was no longer an option. My father, quiet as always, seemed haunted by the truth he could no longer ignore. The chaos I had unleashed wasn't just a moment, it was a new reality, one that none of us could escape. Walking away from that night, I felt something I had never felt before, an unshakable sense of strength that wasn't borrowed from anyone else, that wasn't dependent on their approval or validation. For years I had lived in the shadow of their voices, believing that silence was my only form of survival. But now, for the first time, I knew what it meant to be free. The words I had spoken didn't just change the way they looked at me, they changed the way I looked at myself. I no longer carried the weight of needing them to see me, because I finally saw myself. That realization was the beginning of everything. The house didn't feel the same anymore, and neither did I. I noticed the way their eyes followed me, as if they were waiting for me to go back to the quiet, obedient version of myself they were comfortable with. But I didn't. I moved differently. I spoke differently. I carried myself with a confidence that unsettled them. They were used to me shrinking, apologizing, retreating into silence. Now, when I entered a room, I didn't lower my gaze or fold into the background. I stood tall, and that alone was enough to remind them of the power shift they couldn't undo. They could no longer dismiss me with a single comment, no longer erase me with their laughter, no longer convince me that I didn't matter. It was strange at first, adjusting to this new version of myself. I had been conditioned for so long to accept their cruelty as normal, to hide my pain, to believe that my voice had no value. Stepping into my own strength felt both exhilarating and terrifying. There were moments I doubted myself, moments I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had destroyed the fragile balance of our family beyond repair. But then I would remember the years of silence, the nights I cried alone, the constant humiliation, and I knew that speaking up hadn't destroyed anything, it had revealed what was already broken. I wasn't the one who caused the wreckage. I was the one finally refusing to live in it. They were the ones who had to face the consequences now. My mother's life, so carefully constructed around control and dominance, no longer fit the way it used to. Every interaction with me reminded her of the truth I had spoken, and she couldn't escape it. My siblings had to reconcile with the guilt of standing by while I was silenced, and the discomfort of knowing that their indifference had made them complicit. My father had to live with the knowledge that his silence had enabled her cruelty, that his refusal to act had allowed the damage to grow unchecked. They were left with the wreckage of their own choices, and there was no way to undo it. For once, I wasn't the one carrying the burden. They were. I walked away stronger, not because I had destroyed them, but because I had finally reclaimed myself. I had taken back the power they had spent years trying to strip from me. I no longer needed their approval, their acknowledgement, or their love to define my worth. I mattered, whether they admitted it or not. That truth burned inside me like a steady flame, guiding me through the aftermath. Every time I remembered her words, "Don't pretend you matter," I felt the fire rise again, but this time it wasn't anger or pain. It was certainty. I knew now that I mattered more than she could ever accept, and that was enough. The change in me rippled outward. I found myself speaking up in places I never had before, refusing to let anyone treat me as if I were invisible. I stopped apologizing for existing, stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. It wasn't about being loud or confrontational, it was about owning my space, my truth, my voice. I carried myself differently at school, at work, in every interaction. People noticed, even if they didn't know why. The same person who had once been overlooked was now undeniable, and that shift extended far beyond the walls of my home. Their lives, on the other hand, were tangled in the consequences. My mother could no longer command the same respect she once had. The illusion of control was shattered, and everyone in the house felt the fracture. My siblings, who had once leaned on her authority, now questioned it, even if silently. My father, who had always avoided conflict, now had to sit with the reality that his passivity had cost him more than he realized. The balance of power that had held our family together for years was gone, and they all knew it. They couldn't look at me the same way anymore because they couldn't unhear what I had said. The truth had changed everything, and no amount of denial could erase it. I didn't set out to destroy them, but in a way, my words had done exactly that. They had dismantled the carefully crafted world they had built, one where I was the forgotten one, the quiet one, the invisible one. That world no longer existed. I had torn it down with the force of my voice, and in its place stood something new, something they didn't know how to navigate. Their lives would never return to what they were before, because the person they had depended on to stay silent no longer existed. I was no longer the child they could control, no longer the scapegoat they could push aside, no longer the shadow they could pretend away. I was something they could neither ignore nor undo, and though the chaos lingered, though the tension remained, I walked away with a strength they could never take from me. I had finally broken free of the cage they built, and with every step forward, I left pieces of it behind. They were trapped in the ruins of their own making, and I was free. That was the difference now. Their lives were forever altered by the truth, but mine had just begun to take shape in a way I had never thought possible.